It is great to welcome back to the program today Cass Sunstein, who is a professor at Harvard Law School, also author of the new book out today, Unfreedom. Cass, so great to have you back on today.
It's great to be here. I really thank you.
So, to get us into the topic of the new book, one of the things I gathered from it, and it will be embarrassing if it was not your intent, is that freedom and liberty in the sort of modern American libertarian ideal is simply not enough to really have, as humans, something closer to sort of self-determination, some higher level of freedom. Did I correctly gather that from what you wrote?
Yes, so I love the way you phrased it, that it's not enough. So the book is broadly sympathetic to the libertarian ideal, which is that people have freedom of choice. But the inadequacy of that ideal, not the incorrectness of the ideal, but the inadequacy of that ideal is, I think, clearer every day.
So maybe first we can start to define what the ideal might look like, and then maybe after that we can justify what government's involvement in that pursuit might be. So to start with, I mean, when you think about in 2019, not in some kind of abstract historical period, but today, what is the ideal of freedom that we would hope to see for humans?
I think it would entail, at a minimum, two things. One is freedom of choice, and the other is an understanding of how you can get where you want to go. So, freedom has limits, of course, so people aren't free to punch other people or to kill other people or to run red lights, and that's all very important to acknowledge. But bracketing the question, what exactly are the right limits on freedom, to allow people to go their own way is a very good idea. And also to add, and this is really the key point, to help people meet challenges of navigability. So to say that you can choose your own doctor is great and often, very important. But to help people figure out how to find a doctor or to find the right doctor is essential often if people are going to handle illnesses.
In a modern society, right? So ignoring these again, sort of caricatured libertarian ideas of humans in a state of nature, but in a modern society, how can we objectively define where influence goes over the line and starts to become coercive in some of the ways that you're describing here, that we should seek to obtain freedom?
Okay, so one way to think about what is inside the line of freedom promotion is to focus very intensely on the idea of a GPS device and why it's helpful. A GPS device you can ignore. So if you think its preferred route is not scenic or is not nostalgic, you can choose the scenic or nostalgic route. It also is freedom promoting in the sense that it allows you to plug in your preferred destination. It doesn't choose the destination for you. That's up to you. And a GPS device is freedom promoting. Indeed, it's essential for people, certainly in places that are unfamiliar and they might otherwise get lost. And I think what it's important to put a spotlight on is that if you're trying to navigate, let's say, the criminal justice system, if you have a problem with the law, or the social security system, if you are trying to get access to benefits, or a hospital where, let's say, your child needs help because he or she is suffering from anxiety or depression, you need the equivalent of a GPS device and you're lost, which is a form of unfreedom without it. So let's put a spotlight on that as a major challenge for people all over the world. And sometimes private organizations can provide what's necessary, sometimes not. But the disregard of the problem of navigability is a serious problem for both theory and practice.
There are
Now, in terms
people,
of
oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead, yeah.
so in terms of crossing a line between promoting freedom and reducing freedom, if you tell people that their ends are not the right ones, they want to go, let's say, to Manhattan, and you send them instead to Los Angeles, that's a form of coercion. And it might have a justification, but the presumption should be that it doesn't. Or you could pass the line from freedom promotion to the opposite, let's say. If you deceive people, if you tell them this is going to find your way to, let's say, some economic goal you have, but in fact it's going to put you in the poorhouse, or if you manipulate people by, let's say, playing on their emotions in such a way as to disrespect their capacity for their own agency, those things, manipulation and deception, belong in the same extended, let's say, evil family as coercion. Noticing that in some cases, if you're going to deceive someone who's going to kill you, that's probably okay. Or if you're going to manipulate someone, let's say a child who is not doing what's needed for him to overcome a terrible virus, that might not be the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, so I'm interested in a lot of what you said there, but to drill into one particular element of it, I've read a lot of behavioral economics, the work of Daniel Kahneman and so many other people and folks that you and many in our audience are familiar with. It seems to me that in some of the, to use your word, nudging that we can learn how to do effectively with behavioral economics, there is arguably an element of deception. And deception, again, it's a gray area, because if someone is more familiar with how some of these psychological tools work, they are able to nudge others in ways that the others don't recognize, may be playing on tendencies that they have merely by being human. How do we draw the line between when it's deceptive and when it's not?
Well, I think we need to be specific and very particular to come to terms with the concern. So one kind of nudge is a warning. If you take this medicine in too many doses, you're going to get sick. That's not deceptive. That's an honest warning.
That's an easy one. I think we would all agree on that one.
Yeah, so what I'm going to build is from easy ones, and I'm going to struggle to find any hard ones, and I think that's going to be instructive. So I might be able to find some hard ones, but I'm going to have to work at it. Another form of nudge is information. So a calorie label at McDonald's is nudging you to be a little more careful before you have the high-calorie foods. You can do that, but it's like a GPS device. That's not deceptive, a calorie label, that's information. If there is a reminder, which is a very prominent kind of nudge, where you get a little maybe beep on your cell phone if you're going to go over your credit card limit, or you'll get some phone call from a company if they think that, let's say it's your mortgage and you're not paying, they'll call you and say, that's not deceptive. So the vast majority of nudges are very hard, I think, to identify as deceptive. I'm not sure what you have in mind exactly, but it might be that you have in mind a default rule where you're automatically enrolled in, let's say, a pension program, or you're automatically enrolled in some kind of program at work, which everyone's enrolled in. It might involve exercise, it might involve training, something like that, but you can opt out, let's say. That, I think, would be very hard to characterize as deceptive unless it's secret. And it's unlikely to be secret because the secret's going to come out in a hurry when you are informed that there's a program that you're supposed to attend tonight. So the challenge, I think, for those who are rightly concerned about the problem of deception, is to identify a nudge that qualifies as deceptive. And that challenge probably can be met, but in terms of the things that governments have done, in the last 15 years, and there are dozens of nudge units all over the world, I think it's very hard to find one that runs into the line of deception.
Can you talk a little bit about the principles underlying some of these nudges that would in your mind, be the most effective at achieving results? In other words, we can imagine all sorts of initiatives that have taken place. We could talk about soda bans that cities, for example, have put into place. We could talk about a sort of default choice circumstances like the one you referred to. But as a general principle, what influences behavior most effectively?
Okay, so a ban wouldn't be a nudge. So a nudge is defined as freedom preserving. And one kind of motivation for this book is to get a little more ambitious, though in not a lot of pages. So unambitious in length, but ambitious in theory, in thinking about the relationship between freedom and our capacity to get where we want to go. Um, uh, Nudges that are preserving freedom, like information or default rules, can be extremely effective. So we have a program in the United States which automatically enrolls poor children in free, nutritious breakfasts and lunches. That's incredibly effective. It's reduced the let's say, the non-enrollment rate to the point where in a given year as many as 10 million kids, which is a very large chunk of the eligible population, is in the program. It's super effective. Some information campaigns are very effective. There's a law, the credit card law of 2010, the CARD Act as it's called, which has a bunch of nudges involving default rules and information disclosure, which is extremely effective at saving American consumers over $9 billion annually. Now, for every individual consumer, it's not a whole lot, but population-wide, we're talking about a ton of money. I wouldn't have a single answer to the question, what's the most effective tool? If you make something a crime and have a severe penalty attached to it, and the penalty is reliable, that's likely to be pretty effective in preventing, for example, theft and assault. But even there, with a certain population of defiant people, it might not work very well. So probably good to go area by area. The Social Security program, whether you like it or not, is very effective at producing resources. A lot of people have concerns about solvency of the program over time, but in its run, it's had a pretty good one as a benefit program. So I think we'd want to ask, what is the goal? What are the costs and what are the benefits? For cost effectiveness, the track record of choice preserving interventions, nudges like educational campaigns, information, reminders, default rules, is extremely good. Actually, to my surprise, it's better than for other kinds of programs to the extent we have data. But the reason it's better on cost effectiveness grounds is not that it's more effective, it's that it's more cost effective, because typically these interventions are really cheap. You can do them not quite on a dime, but pretty close to that, whereas to put up and running a program of subsidies and fines and penalties, that requires a lot of resources.
We are talking about the book out today, Unfreedom, with the book's author, Cass Sunstein. We'll pause our conversation there and pick it up with him tomorrow. We're continuing our conversation today with professor at Harvard Law School, Cass Sunstein. The new book out yesterday is called Unfreedom. Cass, I think a great place for us to go next is to start getting into what the involvement of government should be in guaranteeing or fomenting the type of freedom that you're describing as sort of essential for humans in 2019 today. So let's sort of start there. I mean, I think a lot of people will probably be familiar with your sort of political background. What is the strongest defense, legally speaking, for government involvement in ensuring the type of freedom and degree of freedom that you advocate for in the book?
I'd use some word softer than guarantee, and certainly softer than fomenting, more promoting. Okay. And the strongest argument is that if the government is providing information to people, it can save lives. So to provide information about risks associated with, let's say, distracted driving, it's not an extremely expensive intervention. It's certainly a freedom promoting intervention. And we had in the United States in recent years, over 35,000 people die on the highways. Those people don't want to die. They may be making foolish choices, but in some cases, they don't have the equivalent, let's say, of a safety GPS. And if the government has clarity, such as the seatbelt program, the very successful seatbelt programs, and it applies that to distracted driving as well, we'll have fewer dead people, and people will be making their ways in a way that is freer, in the sense that their choices will be more informed. And that's a positive thing for government to be doing. In the area of health generally, to have cigarette warnings of the sort we've had are freedom promoting. I would want more aggressive warnings. That it seems as if the current ones are a little too anodyne, that is boring, and they don't attract attention well enough. But a more vigorous warning probably save lives. We have 400,000 people dying. To help people overcome addiction and opioid use would be freedom promoting. People who are getting into opioids often are insufficiently informed. There's a role for government in combating those risks. It can do it by helping people not to start in the first place, with warnings and with maybe smaller prescriptions in the first instance. So instead of getting 40 pills, you get 10. That's likely to make a dent, at least in the opioid addiction problem. With respect to environmental risks involving air pollution, information of the sort which government often promotes access to about how the air is these days can be both helpful for people who have asthma problems and worse, and helpful for the private sector as a way of promoting reductions. So the kinds of tools we're talking about, which involve, in the case of savings, defaulting people into savings programs, saying you're free to opt out, but you're automatically in. Government has incentivized that. Having information environments where people have clarity about what they're getting and not. So our Consumer Bureau has had a mantra, know before you owe. I think that's a really good one. If you owe without knowing, you're a little trapped, and if you're trapped, you're not so free.
So let's go a little further into some that might get a little more disagreement based on one's sort of political orientation. Let's talk about health, for example. When we think about initiatives to guarantee health care to everybody, regardless of ability to pay, you have one side, which I am sensitive to, sympathetic to, which is that to truly be free and to be able to pursue what it is that you want to do, you need to have access to at least some level of health care. If you are unable to get that care, that's going to restrict your freedom. On the other side, you have people who say, well, as soon as you mandate payroll taxes for example, employees and employers in order to get people that health care, you are taking away some degree of freedom from those employees and employers to decide what to do with the money that they make. How do we start to unpack that and find what the balance is?
Okay, so what Unfreedom is about is what I regard as the great neglected component of freedom that lawyers, my own people, economists, philosophers, political scientists, and all of us thinking about freedom have neglected, which is the problem of navigability. And I don't love that word because it has too many syllables, but it's instructive in suggesting that if you don't know how to get where you want to go, you are to that extent less free. And that people whose children suffer from health problems, including mental health, for people who are suffering economically, they want training or they want education. The problem of navigability is often obstacle number one. So that's what I want to put a spotlight on. The more ambitious claim that you've raised, which is that if you don't have access to the healthcare system because you're poor or something, you're unfree, or that there should be an employer mandate in order to promote freedom on the part, let's say, of those who otherwise are deprived of access to health care, have a deprivation of freedom. I have, for present purposes, nothing to say about that debate. It's an honor in ways I think we haven't yet, while saying, let's bracket that one.
Can we maybe zoom out a bit then and think about conceptually the idea of positive and negative freedoms in this conversation? The idea of where we kind of couch the debate about freedom to do something, and when that starts to impinge on freedom from something for somebody else. I mean, I think the debate that fortunately now is a little bit less timely than it was 5 years ago about religious freedom versus freedom to discriminate against people on the basis of a perceived or real LGBT status, which is an interesting freedom to and freedom from discussion. Where do you draw the line there?
Well, if you have someone who is unable to find her way, let's say, to job training, which she badly wants, then I say there's an obstacle to freedom. You can say that the absence of navigability is an insult to positive freedom, that she's making a claim on someone's resources to find a route. That's fair, I think. Whether it's right, I'm not completely sure, but it's not obviously not right. So insofar as we say that helping people find a route to their preferred destination calls for a form of positive freedom, I don't have a particular complaint, but I'm not sure it's true. Because if someone can't find their way to their preferred destination, their negative freedom may be interfered with depending on what the obstacle exactly is and who's putting it there. So you can see the claim, that is, and it's an unusual claim. So the reason I did the book is that I want to say something that's not been said 1,000 times before. The claim is that the navigation problem is a freedom problem. There's a debate about which there are many thousands of pages spilled probably every month, which is about the most of them, thank goodness, are not published, about the positive and negative freedom debate. My view about that is that it has a large semantic dimension, which makes it less interesting, where the advocates of positive freedom claim freedom entails a right to things, and the advocates of negative freedom say freedom entails a right of freedom from impositions of various sorts. This, on my view, has a definitional character, which means what's underlying it substantively is not that clear. Clearly, the friends of positive freedom say this is a good thing, and the friends of negative freedom are not that excited about positive freedom. But they can't. The friends of negative freedom can't earn the victory by stamping on the ground and saying that's not freedom. They have to earn the victory by saying that a society ought not to be providing those things because those societies are poorer, less prosperous. There's less liberty of the kind they value. And then we're talking about substance rather than, that is about what society should look like rather than about the meaning of terms.
When we think about any restriction on freedom, how should we, or to what degree should we be considering the possible negative externalities of such a decision beyond sort of, as you say, the specific substance of a decision?
Okay, so there's a view, let's call it so 2018, which is that a restriction on freedom consists of blocking people, let's say through force, from getting where they want to go.
Sure.
That's inadequate. The 2019 view is that if people can't find their way to the place where they want to go, either because of some literal obstacle to acquiring the knowledge or because of some access to the relevant information problem, they are to that extent unfree. And for people who suffer from addictions, this is particularly clear, and there's a lot of talk on the part of alcoholics and drug addicts that they are enslaved. And I think that's fair. That's what the experience is like. They need something that will liberate them. Okay, 2019 talk. Back to 2018, there's a view that well precedes 2018 that if you are imposing harm on others, there's a legitimate basis for interference with your, let's say, 2018 freedom. And that goes back to John Stuart Mill, who was a libertarian of a sort, and who believes with modern day libertarians that if you are engaging in behavior that imposes harm to others, then it's okay to do something. It might be a corrective tax, it may be a fine, it might be a law. And I have no problem with that. I think that is correct. I would add only that, and the book does touch lightly on this, that in cases in which an individual is imposing harms on his or her future self of a certain magnitude, and it's really clear, then the argument for coercion needs to be explored. I think explored with skepticism, but explored. So if you have someone, let's say, who's buying appliances that are relatively cheap, but they're going to cost them a whole lot over the lifetime of the use of the expenditure, we wouldn't put them in jail or fine them for that, but there might be an argument for energy efficiency standards, which will move the market in directions that will help consumers over the long term. I don't want to say that the argument for energy efficiency standards is airtight, but in principle, it's an empirical question in large part, and it's worth exploring.
The book is called Unfreedom. We've been speaking with the book's author, Cass Sunstein, professor at Harvard Law School. We are linking in the description for the YouTube video for the interview directly to the book. Cass, thank you so much for joining me today. Really a pleasure.
Thank you. Great pleasure.